When Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman left their Kenai River Lodge for a morning hike in September 2022, they promised to check out by noon. But the Oregon couple never returned, their rental car vanishing with them into Alaska's endless wilderness. 9 months later, a ranger investigating a massive bear bait pile uncovered evidence that proved something unthinkable had happened to them, turning what seemed like a tragic hiking accident into one of Alaska's most disturbing crimes. On the morning of September 12, 2022, a persistent cold drizzle was falling over Cooper Landing, Alaska, slicking the gravel paths between the rustic cabins of the Kenai River Lodge. Brenda Riley, the lodge's manager for the better part of 2 decades, was on her checkout rounds. She carried a clipboard and a stoic patience honed by years of dealing with tourists who operated on their own, often unpredictable schedules. The occupants of Cabin 7, a young couple from Oregon named Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman, were due to depart by 11 a.m. It was now approaching noon, and their designated parking spot was empty, but the key had not been returned. Brenda knocked firmly on the solid wood door of the cabin. There was no answer. She called out their names, her voice sounding flat against the quiet backdrop of the dripping forest. After a second knock yielded only silence, she used her master key. The interior was still and cool. At a glance, it was clear this was not a room that had been vacated. On the small table near the window sat a well-thumbed copy of a guidebook, Sibley Birds of the Pacific Northwest, a page marked with a receipt from a coffee shop in Anchorage. A woman's light jacket was draped over a chair. In the small bathroom, toothbrushes were still in a cup by the sink, and a bottle of shampoo was uncapped in the shower. 2 large suitcases, one blue and one black, stood against the far wall, both appearing to be fully packed, as if for a departure that never began. The only things missing were the people themselves and their rental car. Brenda felt a familiar knot of unease. It wasn't uncommon for guests to lose track of time on a final morning hike, but leaving all their luggage behind was deeply irregular. She decided to give them a few more hours. By late afternoon, with no sign of the couple, she tried calling the cell phone number on their reservation form. It went straight to voicemail. The next 24 hours passed in a state of growing anxiety for Brenda. She checked the cabin periodically, the scene within remaining unchanged, a static tableau of interrupted life. Finally, on the afternoon of September 13th, she made the call she had been dreading. She contacted the Soldotna Dispatch for the Alaska State Troopers. She explained the situation calmly and methodically. The guests, Tessa Sullivan, 27, and Finn Hoffman, 28, had been gone for over a day, their checkout missed, their belongings left behind, their rental vehicle absent. The information was passed to Sergeant Miles Corrigan, a veteran trooper whose entire career had been spent navigating the unique challenges of law enforcement in the vastness of the Kenai Peninsula. He understood that in this wilderness, the line between a simple misadventure and a life-threatening emergency was perilously thin. His first action was to have a trooper contact the families. The call reached Finn's older brother in Portland, Oregon. The family's confusion quickly curdled into fear. They confirmed the couple was on a week-long vacation, their first trip to Alaska. The last communication anyone had received was a text message from Finn sent 3 days prior, on the morning of September 9th. It was brief and cheerful, stating they were excited to be heading out for a day hike on a place called the Slaughter Gulch Trail. With this new information, the focus of the initial investigation sharpened. Sergeant Corrigan confirmed the details of the couple's rental car, a gray Ford Escape with an Alaska license plate. He dispatched a trooper to the Slaughter Gulch trailhead, a remote access point several miles from the lodge. The report came back within the hour, confirming Corrigan's primary concern. The trailhead parking lot, a small gravel clearing carved out of the dense spruce and birch forest, held 4 vehicles. None of them was the gray Ford Escape. The absence of the car was a critical, confounding fact. The most common scenario for missing hikers involved a vehicle left at a trailhead. This suggested something different. Had they even made it to the trail? Had they run into trouble elsewhere? An initial limited search was launched. A state helicopter, already in the air on another matter, was diverted to make a low pass over the Slaughter Gulch area, its crew scanning the dense canopy for any sign of color or movement. On the ground, 2 troopers walked the first 2 miles of the muddy trail, their eyes scanning the thick underbrush on either side. They found nothing, no discarded water bottle, no footprints of note, no sign that the couple had ever set foot there. By the evening of September 13th, with no leads and a missing vehicle, the Alaska State Troopers issued an official public bulletin. Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman were declared missing, their smiling faces from a family-provided photo now part of a formal request for information, an image released into the void in the hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something. The initial 48 hours bled into a week, and the disappearance of Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman transitioned from a localized concern into a full-scale, multi-agency operation. Sergeant Miles Corrigan established a command post in a borrowed community hall in Cooper Landing, its walls soon papered with topographical maps crisscrossed with grids and potential search zones. The effort swelled with resources. Teams from the Alaska State Troopers, volunteer search and rescue units from Anchorage and the peninsula, and canine handlers with dogs trained for wilderness tracking. The gray Ford Escape became the ghost at the center of the operation. Its absence was a tactical void that no amount of manpower could fill. Every search theory slammed into the same logical wall. If they were lost in the woods, where was their car? Investigators began the painstaking process of building a profile of the missing couple, hoping their habits or history might illuminate their last movements. Phone calls to friends and family in Oregon painted a consistent picture. Tessa, a graphic designer, was described as meticulous and joyful, the planner of the duo. Finn, a software engineer, was more spontaneous and adventurous, always pushing for the road less traveled. They were both physically fit and had considerable hiking experience in the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest. They understood gear, pacing, and the importance of being prepared. But Alaska, their families stressed, was a different beast. They were rookies in a professional league of wilderness. They had read books and watched documentaries, but they possessed no practical experience with the scale, the predators, or the unforgiving nature of the Alaskan backcountry. It was Tessa's sister who provided the photograph that would soon become ubiquitous. She emailed the troopers a candid shot of Tessa and Finn taken on a hike a year earlier. In it, they are vibrant and alive, beaming at the camera, Finn's arm wrapped protectively around Tessa. The image was perfect for media distribution. It was clear, happy, and deeply human. It put a face to the names, transforming them from a statistic into a couple anyone could know, a son and daughter, a brother and sister. The photo ran on Anchorage news channels and was shared across social media, accompanied by pleas for any information about the couple or their missing gray Ford Escape. At the command post, Corrigan and his team wrestled with diverging possibilities. The first and most benign theory was that the couple had simply changed their minds. Perhaps the Slaughter Gulch Trail seemed too crowded or unappealing, so they drove on, seeking a more secluded spot. They could have taken one of the countless unmarked logging roads or spur trails that splinter off the main highway, their car now broken down or stuck in a place no one would think to look. This scenario, however, didn't account for their failure to contact anyone or check out of their lodge. The second theory was more sinister: a criminal encounter, a carjacking on a remote stretch of road, a chance meeting with the wrong person. This would explain the missing vehicle, but such violent random crime was relatively rare in the area. Still, it couldn't be dismissed. The search itself was a brutal, frustrating slog. The Alaskan autumn was closing in with grim finality. The initial days of crisp air gave way to a persistent, bone-chilling rain that saturated the ground and turned gentle slopes into slick mudslides. Searchers moved through dense thickets of alder and devil's club, their progress measured in feet per hour, their shouts of "Tessa! Finn!" absorbed by the wet, heavy foliage. The dogs, effective in open terrain, struggled in the dense, scent-saturated environment, their handlers growing increasingly frustrated. Every potential clue, a broken branch, a scuff mark on a rock, was scrutinized, but none led anywhere definitive. The vastness of the landscape was demoralizing. A helicopter could fly for an hour and see nothing but an uninterrupted sea of green and brown, a wilderness that could swallow two people without a trace. Then, on the 8th day of the search, a flicker of hope. A call came in from a small isolated gas station and diner about 60 miles south of Cooper Landing. The attendant, an elderly man named Walter, was adamant. He had seen the couple in the news photo. He told the trooper on the phone that a young man with a mustache and a dark-haired woman had come in a few days before the news broke. He remembered them because they seemed a little lost, asking about the best way to get to the coast via back roads. He said they bought 2 coffees and a paper map of the Kenai Peninsula. He was almost certain they were driving a gray SUV, maybe a Ford. The lead was tenuous, based on the fallible memory of one man, but it was the only concrete thing they had. Hope surged through the command post. It was a deviation from the plan, but it was a tangible direction. Corrigan made the difficult decision to divert a team. 2 troopers were dispatched on the 90-minute drive south. They arrived to find Walter eager to help, but his timeline was fuzzy. The gas station security system was an old budget model. The troopers, along with a frustrated Walter, spent an hour trying to review the footage from the supposed day of the sighting. They finally accessed the files, only to be met with a screen of corrupted data. A digital glitch had rendered the entire day's recordings a useless mosaic of static and frozen frames. The lead, which had burned so brightly for a few hours, was extinguished. It had cost them time, manpower, and a significant amount of morale. As September bled into October, the reality of the situation began to set in. The search teams grew smaller as volunteers had to return to their jobs and lives. The media attention waned. The daily briefings at the command post became shorter, the maps on the wall now dense with the red ink of cleared sectors, a testament to a massive effort that had yielded nothing. The rain began to mix with sleet, and the peaks of the surrounding mountains, once merely dusted with white, were now fully cloaked in snow. The snow line crept lower down the slopes each day, a visible clock ticking down on any chance of finding the couple alive. In mid-October, with temperatures consistently below freezing and a foot of snow blanketing the high country, Sergeant Corrigan made the official announcement. The active search for Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman was being suspended. He used carefully chosen words like indefinitely and pending new information, but everyone understood the meaning. Winter had won. The searchers packed their gear, the maps were taken down from the walls, and the command post was closed. The case was formally moved to the status of an open but inactive investigation, a cold case. For the families back in Oregon, the suspension of the search was a devastating blow, replacing the acute anxiety of the search with the dull, permanent ache of uncertainty. Winter settled over the Kenai Peninsula, a vast, silent blanket of white, locking away the secret of what had happened to Tessa and Finn for the long, dark months to come. 9 months passed. The snows of the 2022 to 2023 winter, which had fallen with such finality on the search for Tessa and Finn, finally receded. The Alaskan landscape underwent its violent, explosive transformation from white to green. Rivers swelled with meltwater, the dormant ground softened into mud, and the air grew thick with the drone of mosquitoes and the scent of damp earth and budding cottonwoods. The case of the missing couple had settled into the cold, quiet archives of the Alaska State Troopers, a file marked by frustrating questions and a complete lack of answers. On June 5, 2023, Alaska Park Ranger Elias Vance was navigating his patrol truck down a deeply rutted service road in a remote sector of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. Vance, a man in his late 40s with a face weathered by years of sun and wind, operated with a quiet, observant efficiency. His job was a mix of conservation, enforcement, and public safety, and he knew this sprawling territory intimately. His task for the day was routine but necessary, a preliminary check on several registered bear baiting stations before the main black bear season opened. Baiting, while legal with a permit, was strictly regulated, and Vance's patrol was meant to ensure stations were properly marked and not being used prematurely. He parked his truck where the road became impassable and continued on foot, following a faint game trail that wound deeper into the dense spruce forest. The air was cool and still under the heavy canopy, the silence broken only by the chatter of a squirrel and the distant cry of a raven. He was heading for a station designated KB-117, a site known for its isolation. It was one of those spots that tended to attract problems, poachers or legal hunters who bent the rules, assuming no one would make the long trek out to check on them. As he drew within 100 yards of the station's coordinates, the first thing that struck him was the smell. It wasn't the usual scent of the forest. It was a cloying, sickly sweetness mixed with a musty, fermenting odor, like a bakery dumpster left in the sun. It was strong enough to wrinkle his nose. His first thought was that a hunter had used improper bait, rotting fish or meat were forbidden, or had simply dumped a far larger quantity than was allowed. He slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. He broke through a final screen of young spruce trees, and the scene opened into a small, mossy clearing. What he saw made him stop dead. The sheer scale of the bait pile was absurd. A large, industrial-sized blue plastic barrel lay on its side, and from its mouth spilled a mountain of decomposing pastries. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of them, glazed donuts, bear claws, and what looked like jelly-filled pastries, all now a sodden, moldering mass. Intermixed with this was a river of feed corn spreading out across the mossy ground. A thick, shimmering cloud of flies and wasps swarmed over the pile, their buzzing an aggressive, constant hum. The scene was not just a violation of regulations, it was bizarre, a grotesque display of excess. Vance's training took over. He unclipped the canister of bear spray from his belt, holding it ready. A bait pile this large was a powerful attractant. He scanned the tree line, listening intently for any sound of a large animal. Nothing. He took a slow, deliberate circle around the clearing, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. His gaze kept returning to the barrel. It looked out of place, its bright blue color an alien intrusion in the palette of greens and browns. It was then that the smell registered on a different level. Underneath the sweet rot of the sugar and the fermentation of the corn, there was another note. It was a faint, acrid undertone, something vaguely chemical, but also organic. It was the smell of decay, but not of food. He'd smelled it before, on animals that had been dead for some time. He thought perhaps a bear or moose had died nearby, its scent masked by the overwhelming bait. He approached the barrel cautiously from the side, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. The swarm of flies was thickest there. He held his breath against the stench and peered in. For a moment, his brain struggled to process the jumble of shapes and textures. He saw the pulpy mass of pastries, the pale yellow of the corn, and then he saw something else, something that did not belong. Protruding from the muck, pointing almost straight up, were the soles of 2 black hiking boots. They were caked in grime, but the distinctive tread pattern was unmistakable. They were attached to what were clearly legs, clad in dark, mud-stained hiking pants. The rest of the body was submerged in the foul slurry inside the barrel. Vance felt a jolt of ice in his stomach. He physically recoiled, taking 2 quick steps back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He forced himself to take a slow, steadying breath, the foul air catching in his throat. He was no longer a ranger checking a bait station. He was the first officer at a crime scene. His training kicked in, a series of protocols that overrode the shock. Do not touch anything, preserve the scene, get on the radio. He backed away carefully, watching where he stepped, moving to the edge of the clearing where he had entered. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder strap, his hand trembling slightly as he keyed the microphone. He kept his voice as level as he could, but the strain was evident. He identified himself and his location, requesting immediate assistance from the Alaska State Troopers. He reported a suspected 1054, a dead body. He specified the circumstances, describing the bait station and the concealment, his words clipped and precise. The dispatcher's voice came back, calm and professional, confirming the message and informing him that units were en route. The nearest trooper was 40 minutes away. Vance's wait was the longest 40 minutes of his life. He stood at the edge of the clearing, a silent sentinel, his gaze fixed on the blue barrel. The forest, which had felt like his sanctuary moments before, now seemed menacing, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. The buzzing of the flies was the only sound, a sickening soundtrack to his discovery. When Sergeant Miles Corrigan arrived, he found Vance pale but composed. The area had been secured with yellow tape, a stark artificial boundary against the wilderness. Corrigan felt a grim sense of déjà vu as he took in the scene. He had spent weeks searching for two people in this very wilderness, and now, 9 months later, it seemed the wilderness was finally offering a clue. The recovery was a slow, grim, and meticulous process. A team from the State Crime Lab was flown in by helicopter. They photographed and documented every aspect of the scene, the position of the barrel, the distribution of the bait, the insect activity. Finally, 2 investigators carefully removed the body from the barrel. It was a male, fully clothed in hiking gear that had been ravaged by moisture and decay. The body was respectfully placed in a bag for transport to the State Medical Examiner's office in Anchorage. 2 days later, Sergeant Corrigan sat at his desk, staring at the preliminary report. Dental records had confirmed the identity. The body found in the blue barrel was Finn Hoffman. But as Corrigan read on, the case he thought he was finally beginning to understand was shattered and reformed into something far more monstrous. The medical examiner was unequivocal on 2 points. First, the cause of death was not an animal attack, nor was it an accident. Finn Hoffman had died from massive blunt force trauma to the back of his head. He had been murdered. Second, and most disturbingly, was the time of death versus the state of decomposition. The body showed signs of having been exposed to the elements for only a short period, perhaps 1 to 2 weeks at most. For the other 8.5 months of the 9 months he had been missing, Finn Hoffman's body had been preserved somewhere cold, frozen. The implications were staggering. Finn and Tessa hadn't just gotten lost, they had met with a killer who had murdered Finn, then stored his body all winter like a piece of meat in a deep freeze before deciding to dump it in the most bizarre and remote of locations. The entire foundation of the investigation crumbled. This was not a story of a tragic accident in the wilderness. This was a calculated homicide. And as this horrifying new reality settled in, one question eclipsed all others. If the killer had kept Finn's body on ice all winter, where was Tessa Sullivan? The confirmation that the body in the barrel was a murdered Finn Hoffman and that he had been recently deposited there sent a shockwave through the investigation. Sergeant Miles Corrigan's office, which had been a quiet repository for a cold case file, roared back to life. The maps went back up on the walls, but the grids were different now. The search was no longer for lost hikers. It was for a second victim and a killer. The discovery had answered the question of what happened to Finn, but it had spawned a host of more terrifying questions. Where was his body kept for 9 months? Why move it now? And above all, what had become of Tessa? The new reality forced investigators to confront 2 horrifying possibilities regarding Tessa Sullivan. The first was that she had met the same fate as Finn, and her body was still hidden, perhaps in the same cold storage location where Finn's had been kept, or disposed of in an entirely different manner. The second possibility was, in some ways, even more chilling, that she had somehow been involved. In the cold calculus of homicide investigation, the partner is always considered. Could a dispute between the couple have turned deadly, leading Tessa to kill Finn and flee? This theory seemed wildly inconsistent with everything they knew about her and the couple's relationship. But in the absence of evidence, no theory could be discarded. The public, once united in sympathy for the lost couple, now engaged in hushed, morbid speculation. The immediate focus of the investigation narrowed to the crime scene itself, the blue barrel and the mountain of bait. Every element was a potential clue. The bait station, KB117, was officially registered to a man named Silas Croft, a 58-year-old hunting outfitter who ran a small, struggling guide service from his home on the outskirts of Soldotna. Croft was a known quantity to local law enforcement, a cantankerous and solitary figure who had had minor run-ins over hunting regulations in the past. He was precisely the kind of person who might have the skills and the temperament to navigate the backcountry with ease and avoid detection. 2 troopers brought Silas Croft in for questioning. He arrived at the Soldotna post looking annoyed and inconvenienced, his weathered face set in a permanent scowl. He sat across from Corrigan, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. His story was simple and delivered with gruff impatience. He confirmed he held the permit for KB117, but he claimed he hadn't used it or even visited it since the previous autumn. He stated it was common knowledge among local hunters that once a station was established, others would often use it without permission, illegally dumping their own bait to capitalize on the established animal traffic. He called it piggybacking and said he'd given up trying to police it years ago. When Corrigan pressed him for an alibi for the estimated time of the body dumping, a 2-week window in late May, Croft's answers became vague. He lived alone. He spent his days working on equipment, scouting locations, or simply minding his own business. He couldn't produce receipts, witnesses, or any concrete proof of his whereabouts for any specific day in that period. His alibi was weak, but it was also the kind of non-alibi common for people who lived isolated lives. He was cooperative to a point, but his simmering resentment was palpable. He consented to a search of his property and his truck. The search turned up nothing, no unusual cleaning products, no traces of blood, no connection to the missing couple. Without more evidence, Silas Croft remained a person of interest, a frustratingly plausible but unprovable lead. With the human element temporarily stalled, the forensic team turned its attention to the physical evidence. The blue barrel was scrutinized. It was a standard 55-gallon industrial drum, its surface weathered and scratched. Under high-intensity light, a forensic technician located a faded, partially scraped-off inventory stamp near the base. The stamp was from Kasselhoff Seafoods, a fish processing plant that had gone bankrupt and shut its doors over a decade earlier. It was a sliver of a lead, a connection to the past that might have no relevance, but it was logged and filed. The bait itself underwent an almost microscopic examination. Most of it was generic feed corn, impossible to trace. But the pastries were another matter. While most were common, mass-produced donuts, one type stood out, a raspberry-filled, sugar-dusted square pastry. The crime lab determined it was manufactured by a specific commercial bakery in Anchorage. This was a significant breakthrough. Corrigan assigned 2 of his best investigators to the painstaking task of tracing the pastry's distribution network. The work was a grind. The investigators started at the bakery, obtaining a master list of every distributor that carried their products. From there, they began cross-referencing that list with businesses on the Kenai Peninsula. They spent days on the phone and driving to grocery stores, gas stations, and convenience marts from Kenai to Homer. They were looking for a specific intersection, a retailer who sold that particular brand of raspberry-filled donut and who might have sold a massive quantity, or had a massive quantity stolen, in the weeks leading up to the discovery. It was a search for a needle in a regional haystack. Most store managers were helpful, but had no memory of such a specific large transaction. Many stores didn't even carry that particular item. The lead, which had seemed so promising, was dissolving into a logistical quagmire, a series of dead ends and shrugs from overworked retail employees. The investigation was awash in bizarre details, a defunct fish plant, a specific type of donut, but none of it was coalescing into a coherent picture of the killer. The only thing they knew for sure was that Finn Hoffman had been murdered, and Tessa Sullivan was still missing. While the forensic investigation into the bait and barrel crawled forward, the Alaskan summer reached its peak. The long days, with nearly 20 hours of sunlight, meant the wilderness was more accessible than it had been at any point since Tessa and Finn disappeared. This accessibility, combined with the renewed media attention on the case, led to an increase in public vigilance. People who had dismissed old memories were now re-examining them. It was this heightened awareness that would ultimately break the case open, not from a laboratory, but from the cold, clear water of a remote lake. On July 10, 2023, two brothers, avid fishermen from Anchorage, were spending a long weekend exploring the backcountry of the Kenai Peninsula. They had chosen to fish Tustumena Lake, a massive body of water fed by a glacier, known for its trophy-sized lake trout and its notoriously unpredictable, wind-whipped conditions. To avoid the more popular boat launches, they had driven their truck down a series of rough, poorly maintained logging roads to access a secluded cove on the lake's southern shore, a spot they had found on a satellite map. As they prepared their small aluminum boat near the water's edge, one of the brothers, casting his gaze out over the placid water, noticed something odd. About 30 yards from shore, in a patch of water that was perhaps 15 feet deep, he saw a glint of metal. The lake was exceptionally clear that day, the low angle of the morning sun penetrating deep into the water. He pointed it out to his brother. At first, they thought it was just a large piece of scrap, perhaps an old engine block or part of a wrecked snowmobile from the winter. But as they stared, the shape began to resolve itself. It was smooth, boxy, and unnaturally uniform. It looked like the roof of a vehicle. A cold dread settled over them. They knew about the missing couple from the news. They knew a gray SUV had been missing for almost a year. With trembling hands, one of the brothers used his phone to call 911, his voice strained as he tried to explain their location, a place with no formal address, just a series of turns off an unmarked road. The call was routed to the state trooper post in Soldotna. Sergeant Corrigan felt a surge of adrenaline as the details came in. The location was miles from any paved road, a place no one would ever go by accident. It was more than 50 miles by road from the Slaughter Gulch Trail, where the couple had supposedly been heading, and a difficult 30-mile cross-country trek from the bait station where Finn's body was found. The locations formed a strange, illogical triangle on the map. Getting a recovery team to the site was a logistical challenge. A specialized dive team from Anchorage was mobilized. They arrived late that afternoon, the remote cove now cordoned off and buzzing with the quiet efficiency of a major crime scene. The two divers slipped into the frigid, glacier-fed water. The visibility was excellent. Their helmet-mounted cameras relayed a clear, ghostly image back to a monitor on the shore. It was a vehicle, a mid-sized SUV, resting upright on the lakebed as if it had been gently placed there. As one of the divers wiped a year's worth of algae and silt from the rear license plate, the numbers came into view, confirming what everyone suspected. It was the gray Ford Escape rented by Finn Hoffman and Tessa Sullivan. The recovery was a slow, delicate operation that stretched into the next day. An industrial tow truck with a long-reach crane was carefully maneuvered down the logging road. Divers attached heavy-duty straps to the vehicle's frame. With a groan of straining metal and churning water, the Ford Escape was slowly winched from the lake. It emerged dripping, covered in weeds and slime, a metal coffin that had held its secrets for 10 months. The vehicle was transported on a flatbed truck to a secure evidence garage in Soldotna. The interior was a wreck of waterlogged upholstery and decaying material. It seemed unlikely that anything of value could be salvaged, but investigators knew the most critical piece of evidence might be protected within the dashboard. The car was equipped with a factory-installed GPS navigation system. While the screen was dead, the unit's internal memory was housed in a sealed module. The entire unit was carefully extracted and flown to the state's digital forensics lab. Days later, the call came. The lab technicians had managed to bypass the water damage and extract fragmented data from the GPS unit's solid-state memory. It was a partial travel log from the last day the system was active, September 9, 2022. The data told a story that completely contradicted the couple's stated plans. At no point on that day did the vehicle travel towards the Slaughter Gulch Trail. Instead, the GPS log showed a route turning off the main highway and onto the very network of logging roads that led to Tustumena Lake. The final recorded data points, a series of pings from the system trying to acquire a satellite signal, placed the vehicle directly at the edge of the remote cove where it was discovered. They had driven themselves to the place where their car was scuttled. This was the key Corrigan had been missing. He pulled up the property ownership maps for the area surrounding the cove. The GPS data showed the Ford Escape's last position was at the very boundary of a large, privately owned tract of land. The parcel was over 100 acres of dense, undeveloped forest. Corrigan ran the owner's name, Alistair Finch. The name meant nothing to him. On a hunch, he pulled the old, seemingly irrelevant file on the Castleoff Seafood's bankruptcy. He cross-referenced the list of individuals and companies who had purchased surplus equipment at the liquidation auction over a decade ago. His finger ran down the list of buyers. And there it was. Alistair Finch had purchased 3 pallets of miscellaneous equipment, a lot that included, according to the auction manifest, assorted plastic drums, barrels. The 2 disparate threads, the barrel from the woods and the car from the lake, had just been tied together, pointing to one man and one piece of land. The name Alistair Finch was an unknown quantity, a ghost in the system. Sergeant Corrigan began to dig, pulling together the disparate threads of public records to build a picture of the man who owned the land where all the evidence now pointed. Finch was 68 years old. He had no criminal record in Alaska, nor any significant history in the lower 48. He had purchased the 120-acre parcel of land near Tustumena Lake 20 years prior, paying cash. Property tax records were his only consistent footprint. He had no active hunting or fishing licenses. He seemed to live completely off the grid, a modern-day hermit. Corrigan dispatched a trooper to make a discreet inquiry in the nearest small town, a place where local knowledge often filled the gaps in official records. The trooper spoke with the postmaster and the owner of the general store. The picture that emerged was consistent. Alistair Finch was known, but not known well. He came into town once every few weeks for supplies, always paying in cash, his interactions brief and devoid of pleasantries. He was described as quiet, gaunt, and perpetually wary, a man who looked at the world through suspicious eyes. The store owner recalled that Finch was intensely private, and there were local rumors that he had set up man-traps and other deterrents on his property to discourage trespassers. He had moved to Alaska 2 decades ago, some said, after a profound personal tragedy, the loss of his wife and child in a car accident, seeking solace in total isolation. The pieces were now locked in place. The GPS data put the couple's car at the edge of Finch's property. The barrel used to conceal Finn's body was of a type Finch had purchased. The man himself was a recluse with a reputation for being paranoid about trespassers. It was a powerful chain of circumstantial evidence. Corrigan knew he had enough. He spent a day compiling the affidavit, laying out every piece of the investigation, from the discovery of Finn's body to the GPS logs to the auction manifest from the defunct fish plant. A judge reviewed the warrant and signed it without hesitation. The raid was planned with tactical precision. Given Finch's reputed paranoia and the potential for him to be armed and hostile, Corrigan assembled a team of 6 troopers, including members of the tactical unit. They staged at a rendezvous point a few miles away, planning their approach for dawn. They would use the same logging roads the couple had taken, their heavy-duty vehicles making short work of the rough terrain. As the sun cast its first pale light over the mountains, the troopers' vehicles rolled to a stop at the edge of Finch's property. A crude, hand-painted, "No Trespassing" sign was nailed to a tree. The property was a fortress of foliage, the cabin invisible from the road. The team moved in on foot, spreading out as they advanced through the dense woods. They found the cabin situated in a small, messy clearing. It was a simple log structure with smoke curling faintly from its stone chimney. Corrigan hailed the cabin, announcing their presence and the search warrant. There was no response. After a second, louder call went unanswered. The tactical team breached the door. They found Alistair Finch sitting in a wooden chair at a small table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He showed no surprise, no fear, no anger. He looked up at the armed troopers flooding into his home with a look of weary resignation, as if he had been expecting them for months. The search of the property began. While Finch sat silently under guard, the troopers methodically worked their way through the small, cluttered cabin and the outbuildings. In a rickety shed behind the main cabin, they found a large, commercial-grade chest freezer. It was running, its motor humming loudly in the quiet morning. A trooper opened the heavy lid. It was empty, but it had been recently and inexpertly cleaned. A forensic technician later sprayed the interior with luminol, and the freezer lit up with the unmistakable blue-green glow of chemical residue, indicating the presence of a significant amount of blood. The most damning discovery came from a small, padlocked storage locker built into the side of the main cabin. After cutting the lock, a trooper swung the door open. The locker was dark and smelled of mildew. In the corner behind a stack of old tarps was a small, faded turquoise backpack. It was caked with dirt, but instantly recognizable from the family's description. Corrigan carefully opened the main pouch. Inside, among a few trail bars and a bottle of insect repellent, was a small wallet. He opened it and found the driver's license. The face staring back at him was Tessa Sullivan's. With the discovery of the backpack, the silent standoff with Finch ended. Corrigan confronted him, placing the turquoise pack on the table in front of him. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Finch's face, a deep, shuddering sigh of defeat. The dam of his long-held silence broke. He began to speak, his voice a dry, emotionless monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. He told them what happened on September 9th of the previous year. He had heard a vehicle near the edge of his property and went to investigate, carrying his rifle, as he always did. He found the gray Ford Escape, its wheels sunk deep in a muddy patch of the road. A young couple, Finn and Tessa, were trying to dig it out. They looked relieved to see him and asked if they could use a phone or if he could help pull them out. Finch, his mind steeped in paranoia and a fierce territoriality, saw them not as people in need, but as intruders, a threat to his isolated world. He refused to help and ordered them off his land. An argument started. According to Finch, Finn became angry and frustrated, yelling at him for his lack of compassion. Finch claimed Finn took a step towards him, lunging. In that moment of perceived threat, Finch reacted instinctively. He didn't fire the rifle. He swung it like a club, striking Finn squarely in the back of the head. Finn collapsed to the ground, instantly still. Finch described the aftermath with the same chilling detachment. He knew he had killed him. He turned his rifle on the screaming, hysterical Tessa and forced her back to his cabin. He locked her inside. He then went back for Finn's body, loaded it onto a tarp, and dragged it to the large freezer in his shed. He put the body inside, locked it, and then drove the couple's Ford Escape to the deep cove on the lake and let it roll into the water, watching it sink beneath the surface. He held Tessa captive in his cabin through the entire fall and the long, dark winter. He never explained his motive beyond a vague sense that he couldn't let her go, that she was now a part of the terrible secret he had to keep. Then in late May, as the world outside began to thaw, she saw her chance. While Finch was outside chopping wood, she managed to force a window open and flee, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded the property. Finch admitted he searched for her for a day, but then gave up. He knew that with the thaw, he couldn't keep Finn's body in the freezer indefinitely. He panicked. He loaded the frozen body into his truck, drove it to the remote bait station, and dumped it in the barrel, surrounding it with bait, in a desperate, foolish hope that bears would find it and destroy the evidence of his crime. He told the investigators he had no idea what happened to Tessa after she ran. He just knew she was gone. Alistair Finch's confession shifted the focus of the investigation one last tragic time. He was arrested and transported to Anchorage, his isolated world now reduced to a sterile interrogation room and a holding cell. Back at his property, a new search commenced, but this one was different. It was no longer a broad, speculative hunt across the Kenai Peninsula. It was a grim, targeted search for the remains of Tessa Sullivan. Based on Finch's account of the direction she fled, Sergeant Corrigan established a 5-mile radius around the cabin, a vast and punishing expanse of dense forest, swampy muskeg, and steep, rocky terrain. For weeks, search teams, guided by trackers and accompanied by cadaver dogs, meticulously combed the area. It was grueling work, pushing through the same unforgiving wilderness that Tessa, terrified and alone, had tried to navigate. They were searching for any sign, a scrap of clothing, a personal effect, or the smallest trace of human remains. The hope of finding her alive had long since vanished. This was purely a recovery operation, an effort to bring her home and provide a final heartbreaking answer for her family. In early August, nearly a year after she disappeared, a search team working a steep, thickly wooded ravine about 4 miles northeast of Finch's cabin found it. One of the dogs gave a strong alert near a large, fallen spruce tree. Tucked underneath the massive roots, the searchers found a crude, makeshift shelter constructed of broken branches and packed moss. And inside, they found what was left of Tessa Sullivan. The skeletal remains were identified through dental records. An examination by the medical examiner and a forensic anthropologist told the final chapter of her story. Evidence at the scene, including the shelter and remnants of edible berries, suggested she had survived for several days, perhaps even a week, after her escape. But her knowledge of Pacific Northwest hiking was no match for the Alaskan wilderness. Weakened by months of captivity and without proper gear or food, she had ultimately succumbed to hypothermia and starvation. The discovery of Tessa's remains closed the final loop in the investigation. Alistair Finch was charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree, one for the intentional killing of Finn Hoffman and another for the felony murder of Tessa Sullivan, whose death was a direct result of his act of kidnapping her. He was also charged with kidnapping and tampering with evidence. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of physical evidence and his own detailed confession, Finch offered no defense. He pleaded guilty to all charges. In the courtroom, he was a hollowed-out figure, a man who had retreated from the world so completely that he destroyed the lives of 2 people who accidentally stumbled into it. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend the rest of his days in a different kind of isolation, one of concrete and steel rather than trees and silence. The case of Finn Hoffman and Tessa Sullivan was officially closed, but the resolution brought no real peace. For their families, the final horrific details of their loved ones' last months and days were a new and profound trauma, layered upon the grief of their loss. The story was no longer about a tragic accident, but about a monstrous act of random violence born from one man's paranoia and isolation. The smiling, vibrant couple in the photograph, who had traveled to Alaska seeking adventure and beauty, had found instead the darkest corner of the human psyche.